Welcome to this historical explainer. Today, we're taking a completely objective, structured look at one of the most complex geopolitical regions on Earth. We're going to conduct a comprehensive historical analysis of the major Arab-Israeli conflicts, spanning from 1948 right up to 1973. Let's unpack exactly how this sequence of events unfolded.
Okay, let's dive right into it. Think about this. How exactly did a brand new nation, literally forged in the fires of historical tragedy and fighting just to survive, manage to fundamentally alter the map and the power dynamics of the entire Middle East? Well, to make sense of the modern world, we really have to grasp the sheer scale of the military, political, and social upheaval that went down in a surprisingly short time frame.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be moving chronologically through 6 main chapters. We'll start with the historical birth of Israel, walk through 4 consecutive wars, and finally wrap up with the historic peace treaties that shaped the borders we see today.
So, Chapter 1, the historical birth of Israel.
To really understand 1948, we have to rewind a bit. After centuries of severe marginalization and persecution in Europe, culminating in the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, the international push for a sovereign Jewish state reached a critical mass. Now, Jewish migration to the region, which was under the Ottoman Empire at the time, had actually been happening in waves since the first Aliyah in 1881. Jump to World War I, and the British take control, issuing the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which officially supported a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But here's the catch. The British had also made territorial promises to Arab leaders in exchange for military support. So by 1947, a heavily weakened Britain essentially hands this massively tangled issue over to the UN, leading to UN Resolution 181, known as the Partition Plan.
So what was the plan? Essentially a 2-state solution. Divide the land into independent Jewish and Arab states and keep Jerusalem governed by an international body. Jewish leaders accepted this compromise. But on the flip side, the Arab states and the Arab League completely rejected it. From their perspective, any territorial division of Palestine was an absolute non-starter, and they warned that partition would inevitably lead to war. Tensions completely skyrocketed, and the British, well, they decided to just wash their hands of the situation and pack up.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, the 1948 War of Independence.
The exact moment the British mandate expired, theory turned into a very real, boots-on-the-ground war. On May 14, 1948, the last British troops depart. That very same day, Israel officially declares itself an independent nation. But, they had virtually zero time to celebrate. Within mere hours, a massive, coordinated, multi-front military invasion was launched by neighboring Arab states, specifically Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. For the Arab nations, this was a necessary intervention to restore order and block the partition. For the newly established Israelis, coming right out of the shadow of the Holocaust, this was a desperate existential fight for absolute survival.
When the fighting finally paused in 1949 with temporary armistice agreements, the map was totally unrecognizable. Not only had Israel survived, but they had expanded their borders by 37% beyond what the UN originally planned. But we have to talk about the human cost here. This war triggered a massive humanitarian catastrophe. Roughly 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted, fleeing to neighboring countries where they ended up in refugee camps. Israel wouldn't allow their return, and neighboring Arab states largely refused to integrate them. That unresolved refugee crisis, it planted the seeds for decades of future hostility.
All right, Chapter 3, the 1956 Suez Canal Crisis. The armistice of 1949 stopped the active warfare, sure, but the unresolved issues meant the region was essentially sitting on a powder keg. Fast forward a few years to 1956, and Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser makes a huge geopolitical play. He nationalizes the Suez Canal, which was previously controlled by British and French interests, and blocks Israel's access to the Red Sea. Now, this wasn't just some local border dispute. The Suez Canal was a vital global artery handling 2/3 of Europe's oil transport. Nasser's move sent absolute economic and geopolitical shockwaves across the globe.
Things escalated incredibly fast. Feeling their economic lifelines threatened, Israel, Britain, and France teamed up for a secret military strike, capturing the Sinai Peninsula and pushing toward the canal. But then, the heavyweights stepped in. Both the US and the Soviet Union firmly opposed the invasion. US President Eisenhower actually threatened severe economic sanctions, specifically targeting British loans. That immense financial pressure forced Britain, France, and Israel to completely withdraw. Israel did secure some temporary shipping rights out of it, but President Nasser, he emerged as a massive political hero in the Arab world for successfully standing up to Western powers.
And that sets the stage perfectly for Chapter 4, the 1967 Six-Day War. By the 1960s, Cold War alliances are deeply entrenched. Egypt, acting on false Soviet intelligence about an impending Israeli attack, rapidly militarizes its borders. Israel sees this, realizes a coalition attack is imminent, and decides to strike first with devastating efficiency. In a preemptive move known as Operation Focus, 200 Israeli aircraft take off in total secrecy on the morning of June 5th. They target 14 key Egyptian airfields, and in just 3 hours, they destroy over 300 aircraft. Egypt literally lost 90% of its air power before most of its planes even left the runway.
6. That's the key number you need to remember here. In just 6 days, Israel achieved one of the most stunning military victories in modern history. Without Egyptian air cover, the Arab ground forces were completely exposed. By the time the UN brokered a ceasefire, Israel had defeated the militaries of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and effectively tripled its territorial size, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights.
The diplomatic fallout from this was immediate and severe. Arab leaders convened in Khartoum, Sudan, and issued a resolution famously known as the 3 No's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiation with Israel. This hardline stance firmly entrenched the conflict, completely slamming the door on immediate diplomacy, while simultaneously fueling the rise of radical fundamentalist movements and solidifying a distinct Palestinian nationalist identity.
Moving right along to Chapter 5, the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
We're in the early 1970s now. Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, is dealing with a massive domestic economic crisis, and he desperately needs to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula. When diplomacy fails, he turns to the military. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launch a highly coordinated surprise attack, and the timing was entirely deliberate. They struck on Yom Kippur, the holiest and most solemn day in the Jewish calendar. The vast majority of Israeli soldiers were fasting and observing the holiday, meaning their military readiness was virtually non-existent.
At first, the Arab coalition saw tremendous strategic success. Egyptian forces managed to cross the Suez Canal and breach Israel's heavily fortified border, the Bar-Lev line, while Syrian forces rapidly grabbed key vantage points in the north. But then came the counterattack. Within 24 to 48 hours, Israel fully mobilized its reserves. They didn't just repel the Arab forces, they pushed back aggressively, driving deep into both Syrian and Egyptian territories, eventually halting their tanks just miles away from the capital cities of Cairo and Damascus.
Let's head into our final chapter to see how this shapes our modern world. Chapter 6, Peace Treaties and the Present.
The absolute shock of the Yom Kippur War made both sides realize just how incredibly high the cost of perpetual conflict was. After UN ceasefires, a narrow window for diplomacy finally cracked open. 30. That is the number of years of continuous, bloody hostility between Egypt and Israel that finally, amazingly, came to an end. After intense diplomatic efforts, primarily brokered by the United States, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli leadership signed a monumental peace treaty in 1979.
The terms were genuinely historic. Israel agreed to completely return the massive Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. In exchange, Egypt made the unprecedented move of becoming the very first Arab state to officially recognize Israel's right to exist. But the price of this peace was incredibly heavy. The treaty sparked massive outrage in the Arab world, tragically culminating in the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. And if we look at the landscape today, it remains deeply complex. While Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, it still maintains control over the Golan Heights and the West Bank territories captured back in 1967,
Which leaves us with this final, profound thought. Israel has undoubtedly navigated decades of existential wars to emerge as a formidable military and economic superpower in the Middle East. Yet at the same time, the Palestinian people continue their long historical struggle for existence and statehood. By tracing this direct chain of events, we get a much clearer lens into the realities of the Middle East today. So we really have to ask, what does the future actually hold for a region that is still so heavily defined by the unhealed wounds of its past? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history that shapes our world.